What if the man the world believed to be Adolf Hitler for the final years of World War II wasn't him at all? What if behind closed doors, a chilling secret hid in plain sight, a double, a shadow puppet, controlling the fate of millions? Today, we open a box long sealed by history itself, revealing a terrifying deception that questions everything we thought we knew about the darkest chapter of human history. Beware, some truths are more dangerous than lies. In the chaotic twilight of World War II, as Berlin crumbled beneath Soviet artillery and the Allies surged toward victory, the Third Reich was working feverishly on a plan that defied belief. Buried beneath the Harz Mountains in a facility known only to a handful of the highest-ranking SS officers was Reichslaboratorium 27, the center of Nazi Germany's most secret and bizarre operation, Operation Eclipse. The project had begun in 1942, under the code name Lichtfahrt, Light Voyage. The goal, to build a self-sustaining lunar base that would serve as a haven for the surviving elite of the Reich. Hitler, increasingly disillusioned with earthly conquests and reportedly obsessed with esoteric sciences and lost civilizations, gave the project his full support. The base was to be located on the far side of the moon, permanently hidden from Earth's view. Key to the plan was an experimental propulsion system based on recovered, exotic energy sources. Technology allegedly derived from ancient texts and diagrams unearthed in Tibet during Himmler's Ahnenerbe expeditions. Nazi engineers, led by the brilliant and enigmatic Hans Kammler, worked alongside occult scientists from the Thule Society to develop the Glock, a bell-shaped machine said to bend gravity and time. Wernher von Braun, already deeply involved in V-2 rocket development, was reportedly skeptical of the so-called anti-gravitational plasma cores powering the lunar craft. Still, his engineering brilliance was essential to building the vessel that would carry the Reich to the moon. Silbervogel, or Silverbird, a sleek, delta-winged spaceplane capable of suborbital flight and beyond. As the Allies bombed Peenemünde and other key facilities, the team relocated underground. In February 1945, the first prototype was tested in secrecy. It vanished from radar for 6 minutes before crashing in the Arctic. Soviet troops later discovered the wreckage and deemed it a hoax. But according to recently declassified documents uncovered in the Czech archives, the second vessel launched on April 19, 1945, one day before Hitler's reported suicide. The flight crew consisted of 4 individuals: Oberstleutnant Erich Bauer, a Luftwaffe test pilot; Dr. Lenny Wise, a physicist and SS officer; Helga Richter, a member of the Vril Society and purported clairvoyant; and Kammler himself, who insisted on overseeing the operation personally. The launch was masked by the confusion in Berlin and hidden from Allied surveillance by a combination of false radar signatures and the destruction of communication records. According to a recovered mission log, the vessel exited Earth's atmosphere and slingshot around it twice before achieving lunar insertion. Then, silence. For decades, Operation Eclipse was dismissed as post-war conspiracy nonsense, the stuff of UFO cults and fringe documentaries. But in 1969, during the Apollo 11 mission, NASA astronauts reported strange objects shadowing their capsule. The incident was quickly buried under technical jargon and classified reports. Then came 1972. Apollo 17's lunar rover camera captured an anomalous structure near the Litrove crater, what appeared to be a metallic tower half buried in dust. NASA dismissed it as a lighting artifact. But when independent analysts enhanced the footage in 1998, strange symbols, similar to the runic insignia used by the SS, were visible etched into the surface. Recently declassified Soviet KGB reports tell of intercepted transmissions from the moon in the late 1950s. Coded messages in archaic German, referencing Kammer 6 and Luftzufuhrproblem, air supply problems. The signals were weak, and by 1961, they stopped entirely. So what became of the moon base? One theory suggests the crew perished within months, unable to sustain life in the lunar environment. Another proposes that the base remains intact, dormant, shielded by advanced camouflage systems and powered by an unknown energy source. The more fantastical claim a colony still exists, preserved in cryostasis, waiting for Earth's political climate to shift once again. NASA, ESA, and Roscosmos deny all knowledge of any such base. Yet, in 2013, A private Chinese probe crash-landed near the coordinates alleged in conspiracy circles to be the Reichskrater. Its telemetry vanished just moments before impact. Eyewitnesses report sightings of strange, silver-winged aircraft rising from Arctic seas in the decades after the war. German submarines continued to be spotted long after their supposed destruction. Some say the moon base served not as an escape, but as a signal beacon for others. Documents uncovered in Argentina in 2006 show communications between former SS officers and unknown parties, referencing a return when the planet is ready. This documentary includes testimony from a former CIA cryptographer who decrypted a 1958 message. Der Himmel ist unser, UND were Karen Zurich, the sky is ours, and we will return. Were the Nazis truly capable of escaping Earth in 1945? Or is this all elaborate myth-making, fueled by Cold War paranoia and post-war guilt? Whether fact or fiction, the legend of Operation Eclipse haunts the shadowy edge of history, a chilling reminder of how close human ambition can drift into madness when war meets occult science. Type next to continue to the next story. In 1942, the world believed Adolf Hitler stood firmly in control of Nazi Germany, directing the war with iron resolve from his headquarters in East Prussia. But a shocking, classified British intelligence file, buried for decades, tells another story. According to this forgotten report, the man giving orders after the summer of 1942 was not Hitler at all, but a body double, a failed Austrian stage actor named Gustav Wessler, recruited and surgically altered to become the most dangerous impersonator in history. It began in July of that year. After narrowly surviving an assassination attempt by a rogue faction within the Wehrmacht, the real Hitler sustained grievous injuries and fell into a coma. His inner circle, Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and Martin Bormann, knew the truth. The Nazi regime could not survive a Führerless Reich. Chaos would consume the nation. To maintain the illusion of continuity, they made a secret pact. Hitler would be kept alive in isolation, and a replacement would take his place. Publicly, politically, and eventually, ideologically. Enter Wessler. Born in Linz like Hitler, he was a fringe actor with a knack for mimicry and an uncanny ability to channel Hitler's fiery speech. After undergoing extensive surgery, vocal training, and months of psychological conditioning under the SS Lebenspsychology Division, Wessler debuted in October 1942 to a group of generals at the Wolf's Lair. The transformation was so perfect, even Albert Speer later confessed he noticed nothing unusual, only that the Führer had become more erratic, more theatrical. From that moment, the war shifted. Strategic decisions became increasingly irrational. Hitler, Wessler, interfered with his generals' tactics, delayed operations, and grew obsessed with symbolic battles like Stalingrad. Some historians have chalked it up to megalomania or failing health. But what if it was the simple fact that Wessler, a former stage performer with no military training, was now running the Third Reich? By early 1945, with the Soviets at Berlin's gates, the real Hitler, now permanently incapacitated, was secretly cremated in Bavaria. Wessler, knowing his use had expired, disappeared with Martin Bormann through a tunnel network beneath the Reich Chancellery. Documents later recovered from Argentine intelligence archives revealed that the two men escaped to Spain aboard a Luftwaffe transport, aided by Operation Werewolf assets and fascist sympathizers in Franco's regime. From Spain, they traveled by U-boat across the Atlantic. In July 1945, under false passports, they arrived in Buenos Aires. Nazi gold, transported through Swiss banks and secret Vatican channels, financed their new lives. In Argentina, Wessler dropped the Hitler persona but remained a powerful behind-the-scenes figure. Known in the expat German community as El Professor, he helped coordinate the resettlement of hundreds of Nazi fugitives, including Joseph Mengele and Adolf Eichmann. But he wanted more. In 1953, under the alias Klaus Hartmann, Wessler launched a political movement called La Nueva Patria, the New Homeland, advocating for a nationalist Argentina purged of foreign influence. With financial backing from German industrialists and quiet support from segments of Juan Perón's government, he ran for a minor governorship, and won. Over the next decade, he climbed the political ladder, his charisma undimmed, his policies eerily reminiscent of 1930s Europe. CIA documents from the late 1960s confirmed that U.S. operatives in South America suspected Hartmann of being more than he claimed. Facial recognition software was in its infancy, but early comparisons raised flags. In a 1967 report, one agent wrote, "Asterisk, we may be looking at the ghost of Berlin in a tailored suit." Asterisk. Meanwhile, Holocaust survivors living in Argentina claimed to recognize him, but their testimonies were dismissed. Too old, too unbelievable. After all, Hitler was dead. The bones recovered in the Berlin bunker in 1945, though later found to be a woman's, were long accepted as proof. In 1971, Wessler, then in his early 80s, suffered a stroke during a private dinner with German businessmen in Bariloche, the Nazi haven nestled in the Andes. He died 2 days later. The funeral was closed casket, conducted under heavy security. But a decade later, a local gravedigger confessed that the body buried wasn't Wessler's at all. It had been replaced, he claimed, at the request of a man with old SS tattoos. The mystery deepened in 1994, when DNA testing on supposed Hitler relics found in Berlin revealed inconsistencies. A molar believed to be Hitler's didn't match the bloodline. Forensic analysts noted subtle asymmetries in photographs from the last years of the war: ears, jawlines, even speech patterns. Could it be that history's most infamous dictator had been replaced by a stage actor for the final 3 years of the war, and then lived out his days as a political puppet master in Argentina? The implications are staggering. Not only did a body double escape justice, but the Allies may have based entire post-war policies on false intelligence. The Nuremberg trials, the denazification process, even the Cold War division of Europe, all of it predicated on the assumption that Hitler had died in his bunker. If Wessler was indeed the last Führer, then the man the world feared most was an illusion, an actor reciting lines while real power passed silently into the hands of others. And if he lived, how many others did? How many ghosts of the Reich walked the sunlit streets of South America, remaking the world under new names? Type next to continue to the next story. What if the history books were wrong? What if, instead of fighting Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union had joined forces with the Axis powers in 1941? In the grim days of June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa was launched, Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht stormed into Soviet territory, shattering the fragile non-aggression pact signed 2 years prior. But imagine a twist. What if Stalin had chosen a different path? Instead of preparing for war, he chose alliance. The secret history begins months earlier. Behind closed Kremlin doors, Joseph Stalin and his closest advisors debated their grim options. Facing threats from Japan in the East and uncertainty about Western democracies, Stalin saw an opportunity: an alliance with Germany and Italy that could reshape the continent under a brutal new order. On May 12, 1941, a covert delegation traveled to Berlin to negotiate Der Pakt der Schatten, the Shadow Pact. The agreement cemented a strategic military and economic alliance between the Soviet Union, Germany, Italy, and Japan, dividing Europe and parts of Asia into spheres of influence. Stalin demanded control over Eastern Europe and parts of Scandinavia. Hitler agreed in exchange for resources and military aid. This documentary follows an alternate timeline. The Soviet Red Army now marched westward alongside panzer divisions, invading France and the United Kingdom. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill fled to Canada, leading a government in exile from Ottawa. The Battle of Britain never occurred as we know it. Instead, joint Luftwaffe and Soviet air fleets decimated British air defenses, paving the way for a devastating amphibious invasion. London fell in late 1942, the British Empire fractured. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet-German armies pushed into the Middle East, seizing oil fields and cutting off Allied access to vital resources. The Mediterranean became a battlefield between Axis forces and remaining Allied pockets in North Africa and Southern Europe. The United States, shocked by the rapid collapse of its traditional allies, declared war on the Axis coalition. But without Britain's naval power, the Atlantic was perilous. American convoys were sunk en masse by combined U-boat and Soviet submarine fleets. In this timeline, the atomic bomb program faltered. Scientific minds from occupied Europe fled to South America or the US, but the fractured alliance redirected resources away from Manhattan. By 1944, the world's first nuclear test was delayed indefinitely. The Axis alliance, however, was not without internal tension. Stalin's ruthless purges extended into German-occupied territories. The NKVD and Gestapo shared responsibilities, but mistrust grew. Operation Barbarossa, the original invasion, was replaced by coordinated operations targeting Western democracies. The ideological clash between fascism and communism simmered beneath a fragile peace. By 1945, the combined Axis forces controlled most of Europe, Asia, and large parts of Africa. The United States faced a two-front war across the Pacific and Atlantic, struggling to rally resistance movements and secure allies in Latin America. The documentary explores the fates of key figures in this alternate world. Churchill in exile, Franklin D. Roosevelt leading a desperate campaign to unify American and Canadian forces, and Stalin acting as a co-leader of a continent-spanning totalitarian empire. Propaganda broadcasts from Berlin and Moscow encouraged submission, using Orwellian doublespeak to rewrite history. Interviews with historians who specialize in alternate history explore the chilling implications: a world dominated by a hybrid fascist-communist superstate, where dissent was crushed, technology was weaponized, and humanity's darkest impulses ruled unchecked. The film concludes with a speculative look at how such an alliance might have crumbled under its own weight. Internal power struggles, cultural clashes, and the overreach of surveillance states eventually fracturing the coalition, but only after decades of oppression. For now, the world we know remains the result of choices made in the shadow of uncertainty, a reminder that history might have taken a darker, more terrifying path had Stalin chosen to switch sides. Type next to continue to the next story. In July 1945, the world waited with bated breath. The success of the Manhattan Project, the top-secret American initiative to develop the atomic bomb, was about to be tested in the New Mexico desert. The explosion would usher in a new era of warfare and power. But what if that explosion never happened? What if the atomic bomb failed? On July 16, 1945, the Trinity test, the first detonation of a nuclear device, was expected to blaze across the desert sky, signaling America's technological leap. Instead, a faint fizz, a minor spark, and then silence. The plutonium core failed to achieve critical mass. Scientists watched in stunned disbelief as their hopes evaporated. This catastrophic failure changed everything. President Harry S. Truman was briefed privately. The war in Europe was over, but the Pacific conflict raged. Japan's fierce resistance and the massive casualties suffered at Iwo Jima and Okinawa had already forecast a deadly invasion of the home islands. Without the bomb, the U.S. military planned Operation Downfall, a full-scale invasion of Kyushu and Honshu, projected to result in millions of casualties on both sides. The documentary explores the grim months that followed. The U.S. initiated Operation Olympic in November 1945. The landings were met with fanatical defense from Japanese soldiers and civilians alike, who viewed surrender as dishonorable. The resulting battles resembled a horrific slog, with cities reduced to rubble and a death toll climbing into the millions. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, which had declared war on Japan in August 1945, advanced rapidly through Manchuria and Korea. As the United States struggled on the beaches of Japan, Soviet forces reached the Sea of Japan and moved toward the southern islands. The prospect of a Soviet occupation of Japan terrified American leadership. Without nuclear weapons to threaten, diplomacy failed. The U.S. accelerated conventional weapons production, but the sheer human cost was staggering. The prolonged war drained resources and morale. In Europe, the absence of an atomic monopoly emboldened the Soviet Union. Stalin intensified pressure on Eastern and Central Europe. The Iron Curtain descended earlier and more heavily fortified, while the U.S. military focused on rebuilding conventional forces. The documentary uses dramatized accounts, fictional war diaries, and simulated newsreels to depict the harrowing human suffering during this drawn-out conflict. Interviews with experts imagine the psychological impact on soldiers and civilians living through the bloodiest invasion in history. As 1947 dawned, Japan was a shattered nation under occupation by two hostile powers. The Cold War tensions intensified, but nuclear deterrence was absent. The United States raced to rebuild its program, hoping to reclaim the advantage, while the Soviet Union developed its own atomic ambitions in secret. Historians speculate that without the bomb, World War II evolved into a prolonged global conflict with no clear victor, reshaping geopolitics and the post-war order. The war's brutality seeped into culture, art, and memory for generations. The documentary closes on a haunting note: the bomb that never was left humanity trapped in a cycle of endless conventional warfare, illustrating how one scientific breakthrough shaped the modern world, and what might have been lost if it had failed. Type next to continue to the next story. In June 1944, Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, became the turning point of World War II in Western Europe. But what if the Allies had launched the invasion 2 years earlier, in 1942? This story explores a wild, what-if scenario where the D-Day landings occurred at the height of Nazi power, forever altering the course of the war and the world. By early 1942, the United States had fully mobilized after Pearl Harbor, and Britain was reeling from the Blitz but preparing for an eventual assault to liberate Western Europe. However, intelligence breakthroughs and pressure from Soviet leader Stalin pushed the Allies toward an earlier cross-channel invasion, seeking to relieve the Eastern Front and open a second front against Hitler's armies. The documentary traces the massive logistical gamble, assembling a multinational force of American, British, Canadian, and Free French troops, training under rushed conditions, and facing formidable German defenses fortified since the fall of France in 1940. The German Atlantic Wall, while incomplete, was heavily guarded by veteran units, including elite Waffen-SS divisions. On June 6, 1942, tens of thousands of Allied troops landed along the beaches of Normandy in an operation codenamed Operation Neptune. But unlike 1944, air superiority was far from secured. The Luftwaffe, led by aces like Erich Hartmann, fiercely contested the skies, bombing transport ships and disrupting supply lines. Without overwhelming air cover, the Allied landing craft suffered heavy losses. German panzer divisions, stationed closer to the coast, rapidly mounted counterattacks. The Battle of Normandy became a brutal, grinding campaign. The Allies fought desperately to secure footholds while suffering staggering casualties. Despite these challenges, the invasion forced the Wehrmacht to divert forces from the Eastern Front, providing some relief to Soviet troops battling in Stalingrad. However, the German command, still under Hitler's direct influence, was ruthless in defense, and the Allies found themselves bogged down in hedgerow warfare months earlier than in actual history. The documentary also explores the political consequences. An early invasion galvanized resistance movements in France and Belgium, but strained relations among the Allies. Soviet leaders accused the Western powers of being too cautious. Churchill faced criticism for risking so many lives with inadequate preparation, and Roosevelt grappled with the public's growing war fatigue as casualty lists mounted. As months dragged on, the battle turned into a stalemate. German forces launched Operation Adlerangriff, Eagle Attack, a massive counteroffensive using newly developed tanks and jet aircraft. The Allies, lacking the technological edge they would later enjoy, struggled to repel the assault. By late 1942, the war had become a war of attrition on Western soil. The Axis powers tightened control over occupied Europe, while the Soviet Union, bolstered by the diversion of German resources, made gains in the East. The prolonged conflict drained Allied resources and morale. The documentary speculates on how an earlier invasion might have prolonged the war, increased global casualties, and delayed the liberation of Europe. It also examines how the atomic bomb's development could have been affected. Without the swift victory in Europe, scientific minds might have been dispersed or redirected. Interviews with military historians, psychologists, and descendants of veterans paint a vivid picture of the sacrifices and heroism displayed during this brutal, alternate campaign. The story ends with a reflection on the delicate timing of history, the immense risks the Allies took in 1944 that paid off, and how pushing too early could have changed everything. The bravery of those who fought remains eternal, but the war might have dragged on far longer, costing millions more lives in the firestorm of a premature D-Day. The end. We've just glimpsed a secret so deeply buried it threatens to unravel the very fabric of World War II history. A double who ruled in silence, an illusion that changed the course of a global conflict, and perhaps the fate of humanity itself. Now, ask yourself, how many other shadows lurk behind the history we accept? Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Are we ready to face the full horror of the truth?